How's it going, folks? It's Juno here. A bit under the weather today. I think I had too much to drink last night, so apologies if this doesn't come across very clearly. But I had some interesting conversations. I don't often go out my way to try and get into these kinds of conversations in person. It's simply an unwise thing to do. Especially in front of a crowd, people can feel compelled to maintain positions that they really don't believe in or don't hold, but feel under some kind of social expectation or pressure to maintain them. So, it seems like tempting fate to converse with people in a social setting about a lot of these subjects. That being said, there are some avenues where I think it's a good idea. And if you're with people that you're pretty familiar with, and you know that there won't have to be too much in the way of protecting the ego or keeping up with appearances, then you can speak openly and honestly and have a productive discussion. For the most part, that was a situation a few days ago, yesterday. There was only one person there that I wasn't very familiar with, and they were known by the rest of the people, so I judged that would probably make an interesting person to discuss a few things with. Again, maybe under normal circumstances I wouldn't have addressed it, but having had a few drinks, I guess I lost a few of my inhibitions, and there's that saying that loose lips sink ships. I wish I'd remembered that a lot in my life. So, always endeavouring to work on that. Nevertheless, the person actually, despite being somebody who was quite at the extreme element, contrary to my normal opinions, did seem to find some common ground with me, and I was pleased that that was the case, that it wasn't that our arbitrary groups that seem to identify with us, being polar opposites, didn't then bind us to having to maintain some sort of impersonal conflict that we would just live out as manifestations of those identities. So, the reason I want to talk today is because at one point we began discussing addiction, and somebody had been accused in the group of perhaps indulging a bit too much in video game entertainment. It wasn't me, luckily, though I'm sure some accusation could have been levelled at me if people knew me enough or wanted to be perhaps a little bit pedantic about it. But I did find myself wanting to explain the context of that sort of addiction to anyone who was listening who maybe was yet to arrive at a nuanced opinion on the matter. I felt maybe this is something I could contribute, and having had a drink, enjoying being the centre of attention, sometimes I went out of my way to fill people in on this subject. And I guess on some level, basically I feel like, I don't see this group very often. If I can offer them something that I've discovered or that I've heard about that seems somewhat esoteric, and I can clue them in on it, maybe I'm providing something valuable to the group. And maybe that's a reflection on what I want. I want to extrapolate things of value from this group, and to do so, we all have to contribute. So here's what I've got. A society of information thieves, I guess. Just stealing opinions from other places and bringing them back. So anyway, the point that I felt was important to make was, while the person questioning this individual about his attachment to entertainment, I wanted to emphasize that I thought this maybe was a more masculine contemporary issue than perhaps a feminine one. And maybe some of the gulf in this person's understanding of why this other person had this penchant for this form of entertainment perhaps could be because, he was a girl and she was a girl and he was a boy. And while I framed that within the explanation of the type of escapism that appeals to a certain mindset and that satisfies certain innate desires and instincts that an evolutionary psychology element would dictate is more appealing to one set or another, I still found that with some of that explanation, this girl who was driving the question originally rejected on some grounds that I could lump people categorically. And I thought about this for a while, and immediately, because actually she was very amicable, I decided to, ask for her pardon and say that I could have been more nuanced, right? For the sake of brevity, to encapsulate the subject matter quickly and expediently, perhaps I had used a bit of over-reduction or lacked a little accuracy. But I hope she understood that wasn't my intent. Nevertheless, I do stand by my view that there are some innate differences. There are some differences that are overwhelmingly more likely on the plot of a bell graph. A graph with a bell curve, where you're going to see predominantly one type of mentality or one type of biological entity, if we describe masculine and feminine in this format. A male or a female as an individual is highly likely to have some variation, but on the whole they're going to mainly congregate around the values and the structures with which play directly into their unique characteristics. So unique for a male or unique for a female. And at the time, I just said, I apologize. No, I didn't actually apologize, if I'm being truthful. I said something to the effect of it without actually saying it. But that I could have been more precise, but getting the message across of there are areas where there are key differences, and those differences can play out with these outputs. All right, we can see them fundamentally. They can be observed because of these sorts of behaviors. But I said that there was scope for sort of psychological distress or mental dysfunction in both, on both parts of that. It doesn't have to be the male or the female. Though me being a male, I'm probably going to be more familiar with the psychological challenges presented to males, whereas I don't doubt I can observe and infer from female challenges the kind of psychological trauma they could be predisposed to, which would be fundamentally different in many aspects, not all of them. And I think part of that now I want to discuss is the areas where I can definitely see shared challenges between men and women. So, again, as I described it earlier with the bell curve analogy, things like survival for men and women are fundamentally similar, fundamentally very, very similar. I've taken care of animals in the past, and when looking at animals and their behaviors, you can see there are lots of shared behaviors between males and females, but the most striking behaviors are the ones that are unique to one or the other. That's why they're picked up on the easiest, because you see the differentiation. It's when both sets are doing the same behaviors that they sort of they can miss being picked up. But again, if you have certain types of animals that male or female, they graze the same. They'll graze the same. They'll chew the cud the same, male or female. They'll walk the same. They'll run the same. They'll perceive threats in the same way. It's only really where it becomes very specific role-based behaviors like attracting a mate where the differentiation becomes so obvious, but then that's where all the intrigue is from some sort of like a zoonotical inference. From that element, that's when you begin to see the differences, and that's where a lot of the attention is drawn to. But there, like I said, there are many that are shared. And in the same way for men and women, we also have many, many shared behaviors. And it is never to overlook the fact that we have many shared behaviors, that we passively understand and accept them, and then focus on the areas which aren't shared, because those are the ones that require context and explanation. And it can be a little facetious to always require people to have to assert that that's the case before you can speak in any specifics, because you will always have somebody who wants to make the very easily critical remark of, oh, you've something has been amiss here, something has been excluded, and it's so obvious, why was this not included? Well, it literally wasn't included because it was so obvious that, I suppose on some level, you give your audience the respect to believe that they're going to be able to catch on those things without having it spelt out. And maybe it's the perception of somebody who is always around those who wouldn't do that, or they wouldn't do that themselves. They wouldn't pick up on simple things themselves, and that's why they feel it's necessary for these things to be outlined, which makes things infinitely more time-consuming and exhaustive. But nevertheless, that being said, when you're speaking around these subjects which people have so much emotional connection with, it can be somewhat delicate, and you may need to take the time to spell out all of the contextual relevancies, regardless of how apparent they appear. Now, this leads me on to my next subject, which is how women are represented in film and media. Now, I hope you come to expect from me in this channel that I try not to parrot or repeat things that are well known or already have many arbiters to deliver them to people. I try to have something new, something different, something worth exploring, and in the process of discovery, sharing that with individuals. So, my point of interest here is that the way in which women are displayed in stories, while often portrayed as being, unfair or two-dimensional, stereotypical, I think that while on some level we can put that accusation towards women themselves and say, if art and reality are analogous in some ways, then maybe that is a comment on the lack of diversity in women. That women are always portrayed in these two-dimensional formats because you don't see a great deal of variety in their attributes in reality. You do find some extremes on a bell curve, but for the whole, they do operate in a very similar location, a very similar area. That's at least one thing that you can entertain as being potentially possible. You can pop a probability against it if you want, and you can minimize that probability as much as you like, but it's still worth acknowledging and identifying that is at least one possibility for this noted discrepancy between female roles and male roles. However, I also think there are other factors involved. And again, this one maybe isn't one that's covered very often, but in terms of society's ability to interpret the behaviors of women. Now, I've spoken before about people who are delusional people, and the psychological elements therein. What motivates someone to have a delusion, and how is it maintained long term when it seems to be in contrast to reality? How do they then persist with the delusion? What has to happen to allow that to not be upset by reality being inconsistent with it? And so my argument here would be, well, if we consider it's very difficult to write female characters with depth, and I'll express why. And I think this is partially from the constraints of our present view of women in society. And this actually goes against a lot of what has already been said about women only being seen as one thing or another. I would argue that actually we're too constricted by our Judeo-Christian view of women being somehow unfalteringly positive. And because of that, we can't have interesting women characters. So if you're going to enshrine and protect women constantly, even in hypothetical situations, you rob from them the chance of any redemption, okay? Because they'll never falter in the first place for there to be a redemption. And that journey of interest can never happen to a woman in a society where the stories told about women are always there to protect them, are always there to show women in the best possible light, out of whatever motivation, maybe out of a fear of being criticized for being misogynistic if you didn't only show a perfect woman and nothing else. But that takes something away then. Now you can't really have a feminine protagonist that means anything. And hopefully this will explain. If I just have a look. And it's so difficult to make female characters with depth, exactly because in our culture, we can't tolerate the idea of a woman doing wrong intentionally, okay? Now, I spoke to someone about this the other day, and we were discussing comic book characters. And while I don't have any great passion for comic book characters, I do nevertheless appreciate that they're appealing to a lot of people now. And maybe there's something within those stories that does have genuine appeal, that does speak about the human condition in some way. Now, I think on the whole, the idea of a superhero is so detached from the human experience that beyond being a godlike figure and an idol, you really can't extrapolate a lot of learning, a lot of experience from that character. You can only treat it as something fanciful that you would, in your fantasy, you would inhabit. But in reality, it offers nothing beneficial. So when you think about characters who have an anti-hero side, so they have some sort of darkness to them, which is apparently more popular now, the notion of a dark hero. What it does is it actually brings some sort of anthropomorphic element to this idol. Now it is beginning to be human in a way. When we accept our imperfection, that's the beginning of the humanity of these characters. And in the same way, if a woman can't have a darkness because we're overprotective of our concepts of women, then they can't actually inhabit any humanity whatsoever. Because if you can't tolerate the idea of a woman doing wrong and then having like a moral indebtedness, a debt morally, and then being conflicted by that moral debt, then where is the growth arc for that individual, right? I mean, we literally refuse to allow the concept of a bad woman because we feel compelled to protect them even in a hypothetical format. Male characters can be held kind of hostage by their past. And that makes the stories genuinely gripping because they're conflicted about themselves. There is still a process of discovery to be observed. And that gives it substance, but our pretend belief that women are too perfect to be at any fault prevents the idea of a redemption arc and how can they grow if they're never going to learn. If there's never anything to learn, they were already perfect anyway. The one sort of story then you're left with is where they're never the perpetrators, they're only ever the victims. I mean, how intriguing can that really be? How can a victim story promote personal development? So what kind of interest can it hold against the observer? Well, the only thing you can peddle, if you're going to make those assumptions, if you're going to have those as the constants in your, the fixed values in your story, then the only variable thing then is how that individual succeeds against adversity, right? So if the female protagonist has to be perfect or has to be unblemished for it to be accepted, or for the security of anyone writing it not to be attacked for making an imperfect female, or drawing these strong comparisons with imperfections in females, or suggesting that a woman could be in some way bad, and then being accused of promoting this idea of misogyny, that women are bad innately, then all you're left with is, well, okay, then the world must be evil. If there's any conflict, if there's any interest, any sort of pattern of resolution, it's going to have to involve her being the victim. So now it's a woman as a victim, which is the only avenue left. If there is conflict, that something has to be overcome. The intrigue in the masculine stories is because they are allowed to be flawed, they're allowed to be human. We get so much from observing their own resolution to their internal conflicts. And so many things about, like, I watched a film, The Egyptian, today. I'd seen it before as a kid, but it's an old sort of sword and sandals film, and the character arc of the main character in that film, the protagonist, is so interesting because he goes from really quite an idealistic and sort of perfect individual. He just wants to do good. He wants to serve. He's a hero in many respects, but he becomes slightly corrupted by the beauty of a woman. All right. But what we realize by the end of the story is that kind of a corruption was actually an imperfection in him. The woman was acting in a very linear fashion for the kind of world that she already existed in before he was introduced to her. You know, this was a manner of survival. This woman had been a slave before and passed from person to person, and her strategy for survival was one that fed on that and reverse engineered it to at least make it so she wasn't the slave anymore, even if she was still having to do the same things. But his interfacing with her, it didn't account for his own imperfection personally, that he couldn't process the beauty that he saw in her correctly. He only wanted to possess it, right? He needed to love her, he needed to have her, and he would give away everything to do so. But because all she was trying to do was survive, she accepted whatever was given her way, and then when he was left destitute and she really couldn't see any purpose for them to associate, he tries to murder her. And then he's exiled. And when they meet again at the end of the story, or very close to it, what he realizes is that while he may have thought himself a sort of perfect individual, just trying to do good and, you know, having a genuine appreciation for love and wanting to help the poor and be beyond reproaching himself, he couldn't imagine why anyone would prey on somebody like him. It's almost like he'd purified himself with innocence so that no matter what happened, he couldn't be to blame. And eventually, when he tried to live in that false innocence, but still be a man and see something that he wanted and that he naturally felt, you know, this is, that I want to possess this beauty. And he became obsessed with it, and it was an uncontrollable obsession. Then, by the end of the story, he on retrospect, he looks and he sees that though she is, you know, now she's destitute, and he has his chance at revenge against this woman that interacted with him that ended so badly for him. He can only pity her and sort of pity his past self. That person was intentionally, blindly idealistic. And that in the end, all that was done that was wrong was that somebody understood his nature better than he did, because he was willing to pretend things were true when they weren't. And just because this woman understood his nature, because she'd been through so many guys who had exposed their true natures to her, she knew exactly the method of survival in that scenario. And she looked at him no differently than she did to anyone who'd used her before. And this is a very imperfect woman, a woman you can really dislike during the film, and that you want to see her, you know, brought to justice in some way for what's happened to this man. But in the end, when there is a justice to be had, it's not against her in any way. It's the fact that he didn't know himself. and the conflict that he brought out into the world through her and then hated her for the rest of the film was actually an inner conflict that he had in himself, in that he didn't fully know himself when he pretended he did, by pretending to be this paragon of innocence and righteousness. And that only when he finally came to terms with that and he overcome that and he understood his nature better, could he then interact with it in a meaningful way that didn't predispose him to this sort of vulnerability. And that's not the portrayal of a very nice woman, but it serves a function in the story, and in the end you don't feel animosity towards her, because it becomes like a version of survival. For somebody who had, a rather dark history, there was no intent negatively as far as you can perceive it, though she used dark means to achieve what she needed. There were points in the film where she warns him against her and says, you interactions with me are going to be troublesome for you. This is going to be problematic if you maintain your interest. Now that was a genuinely interesting female arc, even if it wasn't the protagonist. It was interesting to watch and to see and to try and understand. Because in the end, when he, halfway through the film, when he tries to kill her, it comes as a surprise to her. Because I suppose she's always interacted with guys that sort of knew the score. They could give over whatever, but as long as she didn't promise anything, she was never obligated, and they kind of understood that on some level, that, they're there for the taking. But he, being so idealistic and blind, willingly blind, he is genuinely shocked when all this happens, and then she is also shocked when he genuinely tries to kill her over it. And in that, the individuals do display a level of personal discovery beyond this genuinely two-dimensional framing of just a person overcoming adversity, just a perfect person in an imperfect world where they're under attack and they need to beat whatever it is that's trying to hold them down. And no one who isn't invested in that story already cares about that, by the way. There is no individual who doesn't simply just identify with the hero, with whatever identity the hero has in the overcoming adversity stories, that actually cares about it, because there's nothing to be learned. You don't get any benefit or any value out of the process that the protagonist goes through when it's somebody who's just a perfect person already, and then they just have to overcome adversity to express that, right? It's a story like, imagine there was a rich man and he goes into business, and business is hard, but in the end he gets a lot richer, right? Who really cares about that story? Right? Who really cares that, well, the world is competitive and some people succeed, right? Like, we know this. There's nothing to be learned in that story on its own. And just because, you might not have been immediately successful, if you're portrayed already as, in no way malformed, simply lacking opportunity, then to be honest, it's a matter of time and persistence, and in most cases then opportunity happens and whatever adversity is overcome, and then everyone gets a clap and a slap on the back. But we all knew this already anyway. The really interesting story then would be, okay, if you want to make an argument for how there's a genuine injustice here, then the story has to be real person, not the idol, all right, not the paragon, real person who has, a flaw. Obviously, don't make them into someone irredeemable, right? Because then you just get frustrated. The audience will just become frustrated that, oh, wow, what a great break this person had. They were absolutely irredeemable, and then it just happened, on the road they were saved or something. I don't think that story again has much appeal to it, because then it just feels like random chance. It just feels like you're basically talking about someone who wins the lottery, a story of somebody who wins the lottery, all right? So it can't be a completely irredeemable person, but it has to be at least an imperfect person, somebody who could be anybody. And then they go and overcome adversity, but they don't. That's what would be a good story. That's what would be an engaging and interesting story. Somebody who's imperfect, they go to overcome adversity, but the adversity is so genuine and real that they don't overcome it, that they fail, and they have to then accept their failure. They have to accept it, and they have to come to terms with it, and then the victory then is the personal victory. It's the one of the realization of the true state of the world. All right? That's the story I think that some people could then engage with. There's something of personal development there to be learned, something of an analysis of the human condition that would be genuinely engaging, and not just an applause for somebody that it's good to be seen applauding. It's very self-serving and pointless. And these arts should be some reflection of the knowledge, the inherent knowledge, the passed down knowledge that we want to be imparted onto other people, that we want our group or other groups to know about, that matters. Because what method of personal discovery is entailed, all right, in just realizing the world is evil and you're perfect? And here's the thing. Going back to the discussion about distractions, like video games or any kind of addiction, all right? When you look at the mechanism of addiction, it's usually a type of self-medication. You're trying to overcome a genuine problem, not by dealing with the problem head on, but by trying to bypass it or avoid it somehow. And let's say you are not succeeding at something, so then you go out and you try and manufacture success in another way. It doesn't resolve your actual failures, but it lets you believe you're still successful. So let's say, I don't know, you're failing at work. You're not getting the promotion you want. In fact, if anything, your hours are being reduced. Your real-term pay is going down. Things aren't working out for you professionally. So then you start hitting the bar after work and having a few drinks and forgetting about the problems. Or, you start visiting the brothels and then you feel like, I'm not winning at work, but look, I'm sleeping with all these women. Like I'm winning at something. All right. That's the problem. That's the problem. Whenever it comes to a distraction, what you're trying to do is you're trying to replace the pain you feel, even minor pain, but a constant one, with something that is broadly positive feeling. And because you're treating the symptoms and not the cause, you begin to manufacture a habitual behavior. Because you haven't resolved the cause, so unless something in the environment changes it for you, it's just going to keep happening. And then all you're going to do is just keep going back to whatever it is you're addicted to replace the discomfort with comfort. And this is the issue when we look at, in the Egyptians specifically, it's on the backdrop of this individual's journey, there's this religious transformation taking place in Egypt from the panoply of gods into this kind of singular god, this monotheistic religion that worships a sun god. And what's interesting is on both sides you have these fervent believers of whatever religion it is, but a lot of people look at the religion and think of it as like some kind of salvation. All right, and I think this is what's interesting, is that a lot of people in history have warned us about false idols and false gods, and I don't want to become preachy, but I recognize that there's some inherited wisdom in that they've tried to pass on, which is, it's not that they care if you waste your time like worshipping something, praising it, being obsessed with it. It's not really a problem there. The issue is the idea of God, or a real God, or some sort of real idol, is that it's meant to represent a kind of salvation. All right. Now, most people will just associate the salvation from death. Right. You go from living here to going living eternally somewhere else. So you're saved from a real death. But when you think about false idols and false gods, it's not that it matters if you're obsessed with something or if you have like such an esteem for it that you admire it strongly and some kind of worship involved in that. It's because you're trying to replace or distract your genuine issues and turn them into, well, I've got salvation here instead. Your addiction is a kind of salvation. Because a false salvation is worse than no salvation at all. And it's not just because you're wasting your time, it's because you're believing something's working when it isn't. So to think you're treating a disease when it's just making it worse is the same thing. And the problem becomes when the addiction is so widely spread and promoted that for somebody to identify, hold on, this isn't working, this isn't actually fixing the problem, that can be such an emotional impact on the people who are invested in the concept of this fixing the problem, or at least removing the pain of it, that they can become attacked for that observation. Like, if you don't believe it's working, you need to be removed from society. You need to be arrested. You need to be shut up. Because the addiction, the distraction, the comfort only persists as long as you believe in it. And here's the thing. Issues, real world issues, have this proclivity of being cyclical and deepening their effect over time. As I said before, if an environmental change might take away a problem occasionally, under normal circumstances, once it's established, it usually just gets worse. And if you're covering a societal problem with the addiction of a comfortable narrative that makes you feel better about a situation, then really what you're doing is you're trying to treat the symptoms and not the cause. And by distracting yourself from the reality of a situation, you're allowing it a beachhead and a foothold to establish itself, and it has to get stronger. And when it gets stronger, if your only course of action is to double down on this self-medication, which doesn't, again, treat the cause, only the symptom, then over a period of time, at a commensurate rate, you're going to have to get more and more deluded. You're going to have to enforce more and more false narratives. You're going to have to bury yourself in the addiction to try and compensate for the worsening situation in reality. Whereas it would never have got to that point if you could have embraced reality at an earlier stage. If you could have abandoned your addiction, abandoned your fear, and just taken on whatever the issue was and tried to resolve it, the addiction itself becomes worse through that process than what it would have been had you been able to confront the original problem. So, as it builds at a commensurate rate, you have to keep upping your dose. It's not just a tolerance thing. It's not just that you're acclimatizing to the feeling. It's that now it's having to cover for more because you've allowed a situation to get out of hand. So now you're having to dose up higher and higher and higher. And that's a perpetual decline.